Last time on Powering New Zealand, we saw the great heroes and projects that launched the country into state-built hydroelectricity. In this episode, we see the state projects get bigger and go beyond just hydro, while people's needs at home and on the farm drive our homegrown genius inventors. So now we're well and truly into the 1900s, and electricity is actually now being quite widely used. And this is where we run into a fine gentleman called Lloyd Mandenaut. Now Mandenaut was born near Te Awamutu in 1888, and like all smart people in the country, went to Canterbury University. He had graduated in 1912 as an electrical engineer. Mandenaut ended up based in Tauranga looking after the Amanawa hydro station. He was an ardent promoter of electricity. He was so enthusiastic that he persuaded a young couple to build the world's first all-electric house here on 5th Ave in Tauranga. Robert and Sarah Reddy's house would have no chimney. Unthinkable in 1915, when fire was the main way to keep a house warm and to heat water. Electricity was well in use by then, but heating water was still difficult. It was either heated by a wood stove or an electric kettle, and only when it was required. Nobody had designed a way of having heated water on demand. The Reddys were ready to have water at the ready, but Mandenaut had to invent it first. He designed a galvanised water heater cylinder insulated with 150mm of pumice and with a 350 watt element. It was possibly the world's first practical water heater. The Reddy house was claimed to be the first house in the world where energy was supplied entirely from the public electricity supply. But Mandenaut didn't stop there. In 1925, the Tauranga Electric Power Board became the first in the world to use his single-wire earth return system.
To understand what it meant, let's check with Professor Reeve.
So our modern electricity system was invented in the 1890s by a guy called Nikola Tesla, and he invented an ingenious system using 3 different phases. Now electricity needs to go around in a circuit, much like the bearings going around this ring. So you need a path out and you need a path back. Now Nikola Tesla's system was so ingenious because his 3 phases were on just 3 wires, and when one phase wasn't using a wire, the other 2 could use it for the return path. So this is a really efficient, effective system, and it's the one we still mostly use today. But you do need some expense in the power lines to keep those 3 wires apart. So what Lloyd Mandenaut did is came up with a much cheaper line that just used 1 wire. Now, if there's just 1 wire, the question is, how does the current come back? Well, the clue is in the name. Single wire, earth return. The current is literally coming through the earth under our feet. And if that sounds dangerous, it can be. And that's why Mandenaut not only came up with the design and the construction, but he also came up with the standards, the guidelines, the rules and regulations that made it safe.
Mandenaut's clothesline, as the system became affectionately known, made it viable to reticulate areas in the Tauranga region that would otherwise have been prohibitively expensive. The idea was picked up in Australia, the Soviet Union, South Africa, India and South America, so Mandenaut helped many people around the world get electricity. As well as designing many power stations, he also designed for sawmills, hospitals, hotels, ski fields and dairy sheds. His last design was named in his honour, the Lloyd Mandenaut Power Station near Tauranga, which was opened by the Prime Minister in 1972. He served for 25 years on the One Tree Hill Borough Council, 12 as Deputy Mayor, and was awarded an OBE in 1965. He died in Auckland in December 1973. His memoirs were released posthumously, and in them he said of himself, "I am by nature too prone to seek out a path not regularly trodden by others." So that's why he's one of my big favourites for the Power Board of Fame.
So far we've been introduced to a bunch of guys that are specialised in hydropower. But Matthew Garnett-Latter, better known as Bill for some reason, has a different story to tell. He brought 2 new technologies to New Zealand. He was born in Invercargill in 1903, and he went to, guess where, Canterbury University. before working home and abroad for many years. Now, a previous recipient of the Power Board of Fame, Frederick Kissel, worked for the Public Works Department and its successor, State Hydroelectricity Department, for 24 years. Upon Kissel's retirement in 1948, Arthur Davenport became General Manager of State Hydro and Bill Latter was appointed Chief Engineer. Though the new guard would have different ways of doing things, one thing remained the same. The vision of New Zealand being a hydroelectric powerhouse would be the mainstay, and ambitions would continue to be bold. Latter oversaw the rapidly expanding generation and transmission network, but already Davenport and Latter could see electricity supply problems. In 1950, Bill Latter was asked to talk at the annual Electricity Supply Authorities Conference. The report was perhaps second only to Peter Hayes' seminal Hydroelectric Resources Survey in its importance to New Zealand. Latter reported that electricity demand showed no sign of slowing down. He also did an assessment for the potential of a wide range of generation technologies. Amongst many options, including wind, nuclear and tidal power, Latter recommended further exploring two relative outliers. One would be the world-leading development in geothermal, and the other would entail building the world's largest undersea transmission cables across the Cook Strait, and using South Island Hydro to power the North Island. A committee was set up and spent 5 years surveying the central North Island. The Ministry of Works was convinced that Wairakei could be developed into a substantial power output. There was just one problem. At the time, Larderello geothermal plant in Italy was the world's first and only geothermal power plant in operation, and the reason it had been the only one for almost 48 years was that it was built to work with dry steam from superhot rocks unusually close to the surface. We're here with Mike Dunstall, Contact Energy's General Manager of Geothermal Resources and Development. And as well as explaining the difference from Larderello, Mike is going to tell us why Wairakei is so special.
Well, the biggest difference between Larderello and Wairakei is the nature of the fluids that were produced from the resource. At Larderello, the fluids that were produced there were dry steam. At Wairakei, it was the first geothermal power station in the world that actually used a mixture of water and steam produced from the wells, and that resulted in quite a few new engineering challenges processing that fluid.
And this left many unsure as to its viability, until the United Kingdom's Atomic Energy Authority became interested in it, as a place to produce heavy water for weapons-grade plutonium. The water behind me is 100 degrees Celsius. To produce heavy water, you need a huge amount of hot water, which Wairakei had. And I mean huge. That was all they needed. Wairakei got the green light. It was finally commissioned in 1960 and is officially credited with being the world's second geothermal power station. However, in one respect it was the world's first and arguably had more global potential.
Wairakei turned out to be a very significant milestone in the geothermal development story. The reason that Wairakei was so significant is that it was the first power station that used water and steam as a supply, and that turned out to be the most common type of fluid produced throughout the rest of the world. So the Larderello experience with dry steam was the rare one, and the Wairakei really sort of set the foundation for most of the geothermal developments that followed.
New Zealand has been a world leader in geothermal power generation ever since. We asked Mike what the significance of getting Wairakei to work was for our leadership role.
Well, the first really important problem that the engineers needed to solve at Wairakei was separation of the steam from the hot water, which was also produced from the wells. So without separation of that water could carry over into the turbines and cause irreparable damage to the machines. So ensuring that you had just the dry steam separated off from the water was the first big hurdle to overcome. Well, this was really important for New Zealand because it set New Zealand up as a real pioneer of geothermal technology, and New Zealand engineers and scientists were quite sought after as other countries sought to develop their own resources. It also meant that New Zealand was in good shape to develop the other 7 geothermal fields that have been developed since.
Oh, and by the way, we never did produce that heavy water. They stopped using it in nuclear reactors. It would have been a bad look. The Inter-Island project had a harder time. The technical problems were significant, but Latter worked tirelessly to keep the project alive. After much political debate on both sides of the divide, conditions were right, and in 1961 Cabinet committed to building the inter-island high voltage direct current link, known as the HVDC, but better and slightly incorrectly known as the Cook Strait cables. Because actually the HVDC starts here at Benmore in the South Island and runs over 600 kilometres to north of Wellington at Haywards. But to be fair, the cables across the Cook Strait were the most impressive bit. And don't forget, the giant Benmore Dam was being built at the same time. And Benmore is still New Zealand's largest construction project. 3 cables were laid 40 kilometres across the Cook Strait route. Each cable weighed 1,500 tonnes. This was the largest undersea link in the world. These were the largest, longest and heaviest cables ever manufactured to that time, and the first in the world to be gas pressurised. This very long expressway type transmission line works best with DC rather than AC, but each end of the line it needed to connect to the AC systems in the North and South Islands. So it needed AC to DC converter equipment at both ends. Now, to understand the significance of what was done here, we need to get into the secrets of AC-DC. The secret to AC-DC is the power chords are in perfect timing with the lead guitar. And then there's the screeching vocal. Oh, electrical AC-DC. Oh, right, okay. We've already gone over how circuits, electrical circuits and electrons go around in a circle. Now, if we were to plot this and we had a chart like this, then if it's above the line, that would signify going in that direction like this. And if it's below the line, it would be the other direction. So if we're sending the electrons around in one constant speed like this, then that's the chart that you would get. And that's what we call DC. Now, the other thing you can do with electricity is you can move it this way and then that way and then back again. Now, electricity still works like this. And if we were to chart this, you'd see it speed up in one direction and slow down. Speed up in the other direction, slow down. Speed up in the other direction and slow down. And this is what they call AC. Now, the obvious question is, why would you do that? Well, there is a very good reason. In our modern power system, we need to change voltage. We need big, huge voltages to send power a long way. We need lower voltages to go down streets and into suburbs. And we need lower, safer voltages to go into our houses and buildings. We need a cheap and efficient way of changing voltage. And that way is called the transformer. They're the grey and silver boxes that you see up power poles, or sometimes the green ones on the side of the road. But the thing with the transformer is, it only works on AC of that shape, which is fine because the big electricity generators can produce that and appliances work on it. So the system works. But as we've already said, DC is slightly more efficient than AC when it comes to transmission. So if you're sending a lot of power a very long way at one voltage, it's worth considering DC. But then you have to convert between the two. So this is what they did. They took the AC waveform and they put it through a fast switch, 100 times a second fast. And they switched the AC so that it was all going in the same direction. And then they put it through a filter. And this filter kind of works like a bulldozer. It bulldozes the top off the peaks and pushes the peak energy into the troughs. And you end up with a DC ready to go at 610 kilometres from Benmore to Haywards. And then they had to convert it back again. So what they did is they used that fast switch, 100 times a second fast, and they switched the DC first one way and then the other. And you get this really choppy waveform. And then they use a different type of filter. And this type of filter kind of works like a grater, grating off those sharp edges and smoothing it all out and leaving you with your AC to go back into the AC power system. Now, today with our modern power electronics, this is relatively easy. But in 1965, they had to do this fast switching by deliberately creating an arc across boiling hot mercury in vacuum tubes. So this was 270,000 volts, sending more than the entire output of that gigantic Benmore power station north. In 1965, this was impressive. The project was top secret despite great international interest. So significant was this project to Sweden that Crown Prince Bertil of Sweden attended the opening ceremony. And this world-leading project was delivered in 2 years and on budget, with power station, lines and cables completed in 1965. As well as his dedication to the HVDC, Latta also had another technically demanding project he was working on, Work began on his prized Manapuri power station at the same time as the Cook Strait cables, but would end up being even more controversial. But that's a long story. Maybe for another time. We'll see how many Oscars we get for this documentary first. Latta was awarded the Companion of the British Empire in 1966 for his contribution to electrical engineering. He died in May 1971 at the age of 68. So there you have it. He definitely deserves to be on the Power Board of Fame. Ever spent time on a farm and accidentally grabbed hold of an electric fence? Quite a jolt, isn't it? Well, one of the characters you can hold responsible for that is Alfred William Gallagher, because he's one of the inventors of the electric fence, and yes, he's a Kiwi. Bill Gallagher was born in Hamilton on 17 May 1911, spending his early years living and working on farms. Since the 1920s, Bill and his brother Henry had been inventing all sorts of farming devices. Their most successful invention was an international hit. The road to international success for the electric fence was a long one, and it wasn't just Bill who achieved it. Sons John and especially William grew up to be entrepreneurs and highly successful businessmen. It was them that took the company international. It's still a family concern, and their world headquarters is here in Kahikatea Drive, Hamilton. Today, we're lucky enough to get an interview with Sir William Gallagher. Is there a story behind how your father invented the electric fence in New Zealand?
You know how Gallagher started? Well, father with Joe the horse. They had a family car, the Essex, and old Joe, a wily old horse, used to scrape his backside on it. Righto, him and his brother, who were playing with motor cars and motorbikes, we'll fix this splitter. So they wound up a magneto, which needs to spin to produce quite a high voltage shock, with a rubber band, a bit like a model aeroplane. And they triggered it to the car and put the high tension on the car body and then grounded it. So when the car rocked, the magneto would spin, and you get about 10,000 volts on the car, quite a high voltage. Anyway, they waited around for Joe to do this. And they never caught him. And anyway, they come out one morning, and the system was unwound. Well, they couldn't get Joe around that side of the house, let alone anywhere near the car. And then it was some time later that he'd heard from USA that they were using electric fences. Right, so then he developed one. So he certainly would have been the first inventor in New Zealand, but he does admit that he got an idea. And that sort of revolutionised the world. And that would have been the start of electric fencing. That would have been about 1929, 1930. And then the electric fence came a bit later in the early 30s, and then he got it going well enough to make a business out of it. And he sold up the farm and moved into Hamilton about 1938, and we say that's when the business founded. The initial electric fence was pretty low powered and good for dairy cows. But then in the 1960s, that's when late 60s, we had Doug Phillips from Murakura show us very high current for a short time, made what they called at that time an unshortable electric fence. And that was about 10,000 to 100,000 times more energy than the old battery tick-tock. And that really revolutionised fencing. We took it from dairy cattle to beef cattle, to sheep, to deer, and then the wildlife, elephants, and from elephants all the way down, elephants to rats.
So how did he move from that first prototype to the mass market?
Oh, that would have been on the farm, because he was a test bed. And that's not just one step, it's multiple steps. So he would have got it going, and it probably broke. And so you'd have all your prototype development would be on the farm. When he got it working satisfactorily, that's when he'd be selling it to neighbours. First of all, he got it going commercially. That would have been mid-30s. And then he got it going well enough come late 30s. In 1938, we say, as the origin of the business. He sold the farm, which was out here at Hora too, and then and moved into Hamilton East. And by that time, he was making electric fencing enough to make a living out of. Make them and then go out and sell them.
So what was your role in the success of Gallagher?
When it comes to exporting, Father was a bit cynical about exporting, His idea of export was we'd send a load of potatoes to Australia and they'd find a speck of dirt on it, so they scrubbed them till they went rotten and throw them in the harbour. And then we'd get a load of bananas and we'd find a bug on that and we'd fumigate it until they all went rotten. And so that was his idea of international trade. But he said, he gave me the challenge, you know, you have a go, and we sure did, and that started in 1966 into Australia. So, and then we got that going quite well, and now North America is our biggest market, and then Australia.
What was it about your father that made him an inventor?
Oh, he was naturally curious, I guess. Because the family was, he left school and stayed at 6, but he book read, and he built 2 boats. He read up spherical trigonometry. He was an inventor, a tinkerer. He first started life because his family were farmers, and he started life as a dairy farmer. But he believed milking cows 7 days a week it was the last job the good Lord made, and he was more tinkering. And of course, this was the time, his first farm was the time of the Depression, so there was no money, and so electric fencing was pretty vital. Coal burning cars is one of these things that he made in his out of hours. You know, a gas producer, so you cook coal, produce coal gas, put it through a filter because it's pretty grubby, and you run your car on it. And his 2 brothers went off to war, and because he had a family, so he was seconded into the ammunition factory. So that was his day job, the ammunition, but making coal burning cars and electric fencing was his outside and weekend job.
Bill Gallagher died from cancer at Waikato Hospital, Hamilton, on the 8th of August 1990. He was 79 years old.
So Bill Gallagher's responsiveness to farmers' needs, his frontline salesmanship and his focus on quality control, and combine all that with his son's creative thinking, really ensured the company's success internationally.
Yeah, and by the 1990s, the electric fence was being used in over 100 countries, and for things as diverse as controlling bears, bees, elephants, even used at Buckingham Palace. And they still continue the electronics research today.
So in retirement, he invented a patient hoist. He fixed wheelchairs at the retirement home he was at, and he installed emergency lighting at the retirement home.
Yeah, he's right up there with another Kiwi inventor called Bill Hamilton, who invented the jet boat. And that's why he should go on the Power Board of Fame. But William and John were just as important, really, so let's put the whole family up.
That's a selection of our greatest engineers and the projects they championed. Next time on Powering New Zealand, we see that our world lead in renewable electricity isn't just about history.